Everyone get out!
Hello tankers and tankettes, welcome to one of my occasional What Tank videos where I look at various different aspects of the game. Today I'm going to take an overview of the British heavy tank line. Now I've done this before with the Russian heavies, I've done it before with different classes of vehicle as well, and I actually had a request a while back for me to look at the British heavies and just do an overview, and I kind of held off, mainly because I hadn't gotten that far up the British heavy tank line. It took me a while to get to where I am now, which is at the Conqueror. Now the reason I'm doing it now, I mean with the Russian heavy tank video I hadn't got to tier 10 by that point anyway, but I felt confident enough to discuss them in general terms. I kind of wanted to wait until I at least got the Conqueror, and the reason I'm doing it now even though I haven't got the tier 10 is because the tier 10 is actually going to change. So this is only really going to go up to the Conqueror, and we'll have a little look at the FV215B, but that is being taken out of the game. That's been definitely confirmed by Wargaming at this point. So the British heavy tank line, it's a funny old bunch really. You start at tier 5, as with the majority of the tank lines. There are only still 2 tier 4 heavies in the game, and they're not even really heavy tanks to be honest. The Brits start off with the British heavies are kind of, they're about the guns, they're about the DPM, and they're less about the armour. And you do have one decently armoured machine in amongst the British heavies, but on the whole you shouldn't really be relying on your armour when you're playing a British heavy tank. The guns are also a bit odd because the guns across the heavy line, the tank destroyer line, and the medium line are actually kind of fairly consistent. Now, they don't exactly match up until you get to the higher tiers, but there's some parity there. So it's, while with most heavy tank lines you get pretty punchy guns compared to what the mediums get, in the British tank line that isn't really the case, again, until you get to the higher tiers. So if you want high alpha, monster machines, the British heavy tank line isn't going to be for you. Now we're going to jump right in. We're going to start with the Churchill one, and I think tier for tier this is, at least for the first couple of tiers, this is one of the stronger ones. The reason it's so strong is because it gets a really good gun. Now I did another What Tank video just looking specifically at the tier 5 heavies. That's actually one of my most viewed videos. I don't quite know why, but there it is. It's got an exceptionally good gun, and for a while it had the best heavy tank gun at tier 5 until that was surpassed by the introduction of a tier 5 German heavy, which was actually a repurposed tier 6 German medium tank, and they stuck on that the Konish gun, the Waffe squeezeball, whatever the heck you want to call it. I don't remember the exact name for it, but it's got a really good gun for a tier 5 heavy. This still has a really good gun for a tier 5 heavy. It's just now, in second place. The Churchills are, they're a bit odd. I mean, they're not fast tanks, and that's due really to the kind of the British tank doctrine. They were meant as infantry support tanks. You had your infantry support tanks, and then you had your faster cavalry tanks, and that's things like the Cruisers and the Crusader and the Cromwell, and that the faster tanks basically. The Brits didn't use a heavy light, a heavy medium light classification in the same way. They had more of a dual classification, and Wargaming have kind of, they've bodged things slightly to fit, stuff where it might, they've made it try and fit their classification, even though that wasn't the classification that the British were using, is the point I'm trying to get across here. But I think it's fair enough to call the Churchill a heavy tank. And at the beginning of the war, the Shah B1 was really the only heavy tank around. And of course, a bit later on, you had the KV1, and you also had the Churchill. And on the Allied side, until the KV1 came along, the Churchill was pretty much it. Although it wasn't that well regarded initially, a lot of that was to do with the ill-fated Dieppe raid. So you can play when you start off, you actually get a pretty good a turret, a fairly well sloped turret, but you're stuck using either a 2-pounder gun or a terrible howitzer. you really want to get the top gun as quick as possible and then start grinding with a 6-pounder gun. I don't know why the turret keeps turning like that. That's a bit annoying. But yeah, that's a good grinding gun for the Churchill. It's got a very fast rate of fire. It's got okay penetration. But your ultimate goal is the Vickers HV, which is just superb at tier 5. And it's you want to use this more of as a second line heavy. You can get into the fray against weaker enemies, but as with the, I mean, it's exactly the same with the premium Churchill 3, and this is the Churchill 3 turret, the Churchill Mark 3 turret. It's flat. It's very flat, and the gun mantlet on British tanks is really kind of, the Brits almost use an internal gun mantlet, and it wasn't very big, and compared to how other tanks are, you know, a lot of tanks you can rely on the gun mantlet to bounce stuff, you can rely on the turret a bit more, but that's not really the case with British tanks generally. There are some exceptions though. So it's slow, it's more of a second line tank, you have to more sit back and let you know, the KVs and the T1 heavies take the beating, and you sit and support with this absolutely amazing gun. The armour is not so bad on the hull, it's decent for side scraping, but the Churchills have a problem with the fact that, I mean, it's like the tier 5 and the tier 6 French tanks as well, where the tracks are actually integrated into the hull. It is entirely possible, you know, if you're facing someone dead on, you can shoot into the track from the front and you can damage somebody and potentially track them at the same time, as long as you're hitting that hull hitbox. Obviously if you're shooting down here, there's nothing behind the track, but that upper part of the sponson, as it's called, you're basically shooting into the hull of the tank through the track, and that's a problem. So angling's quite important. The given armour is, I mean, it's good on the Churchill, but that is the one thick plate, and if you can angle so that you're only ever showing that to the enemy rather than the weaker part of your upper front plate, then that will help you a bit. That will bounce some more stuff. But there's a bit of a problem with the Churchill in that these tracks as well. There are, if you can get someone to hit this, you know, this strip of side armour here, that's fine. But if they're shooting through the gaps in the tracks, you can see there that if you get just the right place, it's incredibly weak. So it's still a risk, even side scraping in a Churchill. So it might be worth doing in some circumstances, but if you come across an enemy that knows what they're doing, they can hit you through that gap, and it's really annoying. There's also a very prominent turret ring, but people aren't usually going to be taking the time to shoot the turret ring when they can just hit your turret face, because that's not particularly strong either. There's also, if there are ever multi-gun mechanisms introduced to this game, there's a 3-inch howitzer, which is basically this 3-inch howitzer, mounted into the hull as well. But it wouldn't really enhance the Churchill experience at all, because frankly it's an absolutely terrible gun. There's very little that you could effectively use it against, and the fact that it's kind of fixed in the hull pretty much, yeah, good luck trying to actually aim that at anything effectively. So then we move on to the tier 6, the Churchill VII, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, you get some better armor. Again, you've got the hitbox problem with the tracks, that if you hit in just the right place, you can pen through the tracks. But generally the armour is a lot tougher on this, and again, angling's fairly important. You don't have that kind of lopsided frontal armour anymore, so you can kind of angle either way. There's no preferential angling on this. You've also got a much better turret. You actually have the unique feature on this that these track links here, now I have read, it doesn't show on the armour model. Oh, it does there. It's not the frontal ones, it's the side ones. Okay. These are the only, this is the only tank in the game where the track links on the turret actually count as spaced armour, but not the frontal ones, which is what I thought. But it clearly shows on the armour model there that it's these, it's the ones on the side that give you, that basically counts as spaced armour. And I don't know why they've modelled it that the ones on the side do, but the ones on the front don't. Anyway, I call this the Dennis Healy tank, and if you're of a right age in the UK, or you just happen to have a bit of knowledge, you'll know why I call it the Dennis Healy tank, because it's got those eyebrows. But it's generally tougher in terms of its armour, but frankly the gun is not much of an upgrade at all. It's barely an upgrade on the Vickers HV, and that is one of the weakest heavy tank guns at tier 6. It's fairly terrible. You consider that you are coming up against like the ARL-44, which has got the best penetration of all. That's got 212 average pen at tier 6. And a lot of other tanks have got kind of like 260, 270 plus. 260? What? Wow, that would be good for tier 6. 160 to 170. So you are really lagging behind in terms of your armament. The rate of fire is still good, the accuracy is still good, but yeah, generally I consider this one of the weakest tier for tier British heavies, just because of that absolutely lackluster gun that you get. And again, it's kind of in keeping with the, you know, a lot of the heavy tank lines, they get to tier 6 and they get a much beefier gun to play with, but not the British. So if you're going for big guns, the Brits are not the tanks for you, especially. Then we move on to the Black Prince, which is like, it's kind of a super Churchill, basically. It's that kind of pattern, that kind of design. Again, it's integrated tracks with the hull, so you can be shot through the front of the tracks, and you have to be wary of that, so a bit of angling always helps. I don't think it has the same holes in the the front part of the track, the front part of the sponson, that the previous two Churchills do. And the front armor, again, it's a big upgrade, and this is probably tier for tier the best armor that you will get on a British heavy. The best of it is the turret, but the front armor is pretty tough as well. You've got 140 on that lower front plate area, and if you're angling that sufficiently, you know that's going to be fairly tough. And you've got the upper front plate being fairly tough there as well. The side armor is, you know, it's enough for side scraping, but the thing is, it's great when you're bottom tier, when you're top tier, but when you're bottom tier, it's really not worth that much, just because generally speaking, it's fairly flat. However, the biggest upgrade armor-wise is the turret, which is absolutely fantastic, because suddenly you've gone from this big flat turret face to a much stronger design. And yes, it's still fairly flat, but you've got this very, very strong strip of 240mm armor, which will bounce a lot of stuff. You've also got a very strong gun mantlet, and you can see there, if stuff hits you in the gun mantlet, there are a lot of places where that's just, you know, there's very little that can pen some of these areas. So the turret's a major upgrade, and that means that whereas in the previous Churchills, you know, that's not a terrible turret, but going hull down's not generally a great idea, because although you're giving people a smaller target to shoot at, you know, it's a mixed bag. You're giving people a small target to shoot at, but the smaller target that they're shooting at is also much easier for them to pen than some of your other armor. So suddenly your turret's much less of a liability, and you have an upgrade in your armament, but you are packing, it's a 17-pounder gun, and you've got at tier 7 the equivalent penetration that most tanks have got at tier 6 or better, most of the heavies. And the alpha damage, again, it's barely an upgrade. You get an extra 10 average alpha damage on the 77mm Mark II. So, yeah, I mean, it's got a great rate of fire, but you're probably going to find yourself reaching for the premium rounds fairly often. I mean, 171, it's not terrible in terms of, you know, it's just about what the IS has, for instance. It's not like there aren't other tier 7s that have that level of penetration. It's just some of the tier 6s have that level of penetration with much more alpha, and most of the tier 7s have got a better gun than this. So you really are relying on the rate of fire, you're relying on the accuracy, and, you know, weak spot knowledge helps when you're driving a tank like this. It's also the slowest of the Churchills, so you're not going to get anywhere particularly fast in this thing. Planning where you're going to go on the battlefield is particularly important with the Churchills generally, but this one most of all, just because you're not really, once you arrive somewhere, you've arrived. You can't really rush back to defend another flank or anything like that. So your battlefield positioning is especially important. You've got to think about team composition, what you're likely to meet at various areas of the map, and where you're most likely to be needed. If there is a particular area on a particular map where you think, right, you know, you're top tier and you think there's going to be a lot of heavy tanks there, then that's probably where you should be. Although, of course, also being slow, you have to watch out for artillery, because you're not really going to dodge any artillery shells in this thing at all, ever. So, then we get to tier 8, and basically it's a complete sea change. The tier 8 upwards experience is that's when the Churchills kind of, well, obviously they give way to, you know, different tanks, but the whole style of play that you learned with the Churchills becomes irrelevant almost, I want to say. The kinds of guns you get are the same. There is actually a remarkable uniformity of guns on tier 8 because you are using, as your top gun, you're using a 20-pounder, and you get the 20-pounder Type B. You've basically got, we'll skip ahead briefly to the tier 9, you've basically got a Conqueror hull with a Centurion Mark II turret. So it's a kind of a hybrid heavy. It's a medium tank gun with a medium tank turret on a heavy tank hull. What this means in practice is that although you get the same firepower as the Centurion, and obviously the Centurion has better mobility, and it's hard to say this is, you know, has great mobility, but it's still better than the Black Prince. You have better gun handling, you have a better rate of fire, basically, and it's also got very nice gun depression, this machine. And it's not like the Churchills don't have especially good gun depression. This has 10 degrees, so this gets a lot better. This is basically British medium levels of gun depression. And with that fairly strong turret, because the Centurion turret's pretty good. It's not invulnerable, but if you can get people to hit the gun mantlet, a lot of the time stuff will bounce, but it depends exactly where they hit you. If they hit you around the edges of the turret, they've got a much better chance of actually penning. But you're able to go hull down much more effectively with this thing. It's not quite the hull down monster that, say, the T-32 is, but it's still pretty damn nice. You've still got a decent upper front plate, and you'll notice that the way the tank looks has changed utterly. It looks a lot more like the other heavies in the game in terms of the kind of upper front plate, lower front plate combo. And the tracks, again, you've gone from tracks integrated into the hull to much more normal tracks. So you no longer have to worry about being damaged and tracked at the same time, unless you're giving somebody your axle, of course. But your upper front plate is fairly strong, and it's pretty decent armor for a tier 8. If you're angling sufficiently, you do have enough to bounce stuff off there, but your side armor's pretty weak, so you know, side scraping in this is generally not a good idea. You can see even you have to be at such an extreme angle to get those chances of a ricochet. And if you're angling, you know, in a Russian tank, you'd sort of be angling maybe like there, and that's just going to get you penned all day long unless they hit the very back area. But yeah, side scraping is not generally a thing you do past tier 7 in the British heavies. Hull down is much better. If you can wiggle around and get people to shoot your upper front plate, that's fantastic. But generally you don't rely on the hull armor of these things. You want to use terrain a lot more where possible. So it's a bit more like the American tanks in that way. Don't so much rely on the hull. You'll occasionally get bounces, but you know, terrain is your friend, basically. So the 20-pounder is really good. It's got a good rate of fire. I think it's definitely superior to the 20-pounder that you get, which is the Type A. I mean, the stats are the same, but the handling is worse on the Centurion. And of course, you also get the 20-pounder on the AT-15, which is even more of a DPM monster. But of course, with the Caernarvon, you've got a very good turret to work with on top of, you know, it's a reasonable hull. It's not great, it's not terrible. The other thing you have to do, you do have to watch out for, is ammo rack damage, and this is from tier 8 upwards. This is a theme with the Brits, that the mediums and the heavies, you have to be very careful about taking ammo rack damage, and it's just a thing that you have to live with. So crew skills are quite important. You can also put on a wet ammo rack if you're really having problems with it, but I don't think it'll make that big of a difference. I will say also, I've not said so far, but with the rate of fire on these guns, that, you know, I haven't mentioned equipment, but a loader, a gun rammer is pretty much essential equipment on all British heavies, just to emphasise that rate of fire, because the base rate of fire is pretty good, but the extra DPM that the gun rammer will give you will really help you out in a lot of situations, because it's all about getting as much fire into the enemy as possible with British heavies. So I don't think I've got anything else to say about the Caernarvon. You know, I rather enjoyed playing mine, and all in all, I think it's a fairly good medium tank. You know, it's got penetration up there with the best of the, or well, most of the best of the tier 8 heavies with this gun. But it has medium tank damage basically, but the DPM makes up for it, and the accuracy makes up for it as well. Then we have the Conqueror, and again this is actually quite a big change. You've got the same hull, but it's much less effective at tier 9 than it is tier 8. Just because you're seeing bigger guns. Your turret also suddenly drastically changes. I mean, we look at stock Conqueror, and that's kind of indistinguishable from the Caernarvon. And once you get the top turret, well, actually, it's a less good turret almost. You have less gun depression. This has got 10 degrees of gun depression, which is really great, and this has got 7, which is okay. It's still decent, but it's not quite as good. And I have struggled more with the Conqueror, and I think that's because I figured out. I think that's because the reduced amount of gun depression means I actually have to expose more of the hull when I'm firing over terrain, and that means you're going to take more fire. But also the turret is a hell of a lot weaker. It is very, very easy to pen the turret cheeks on this thing. And if you're ever fighting against a Conqueror, the temptation is to try and shoot the roof, the commander's cupola thing. And if you just hit the kind of flat bit there, yeah, you can pen it, but it's a tricky shot to make unless you're at close range. If you hit the actual hatch bit, you're probably just going to bounce off. Whereas the turret cheeks are a heck of a lot easier. I mean, look at that. That is less than 200 millimeters effective armor. Most things at tier 9 are going to pen that. Even the strongest front armor here is only 152. So unless people hit your gun mantle at dead on, or unless they're shooting at your turret roof, I mean, you can see there that it's weak, but that is a pretty much an auto bounce angle, given that the sloping of that roof there. So always go for the turret cheeks here if you're fighting against this thing. They are really the bane of the existence. The flip side is that you finally get a heavy tank gun to play with. You finally get something a bit meatier. Now, I actually played the Talky line first, so I knew what to expect from this gun, and the Talky has exceptional gun handling with the L1A1 120mm gun. It's a really good gun, 260 pen, 400 average alpha, and on the Talky, I mean, it's just a DPM monster. It's got the best DPM in the game, bar none. But of course, it's got its own drawbacks. It's got various horrible weak spots. It has, it's slow, it's sluggish, and obviously it doesn't have a turret. The Conqueror does have a turret. Obviously it's got less good DPM stats, but it's still pretty good for a tier 9. I've struggled a bit more with it, like I've said, because I've been taking more damage than I'm used to. I initially started off trying to trust the turret. You quickly learn the error of your ways doing that. The gun depression, the reduced gun depression, I found a bit painful, and I was also, I don't know, I was struggling a bit, I think, because it's more like, initially I was trying to play it like an upguns Caernarvon, and that didn't work. Then I thought, okay, I'll play it like a bit more like the M103, and that didn't work. And now what I'm doing, which is proving a bit more successful, is actually playing it like a French heavy. And when you're playing the French heavies from tier 8 upwards, you basically, or even tier 7 upwards, you basically have to deal with the fact that you have very little armor but a very good gun. And of course the tier 8 upwards ones all have auto loaders, and it's about the burst damage, and occasionally it's about taking a hit so that you can unload your clip at somebody. Of course you don't have a clip with this. You've got a very good rate of fire and you've still got very good gun handling, but you are just a conventional tank. You're firing one shot at a time. So in a way it's a bit more difficult to play than the French autoloaders, but because you don't have an autoloader yourself, you're a less of a high priority target for people. If people see a 5100 or a 5120 or whatever coming over the hill, they're going to shoot that first because they think that's weak, that's got a very dangerous capability in the right hands. Whereas the Conqueror, people get a bit less scared by that. So again, it's almost, you're going back to the Churchill and the Churchill VI. You have to almost be a second line support tank. You can't really be at the front taking the brunt of the damage. You've got to hang back and use that gun to your best advantage, because the gun is the thing about this tank. You know, the rest of it's not particularly great. So the tier 10, I will cover it briefly, but we're just about done. It's basically fictional. It's a kind of a Conqueror hull, and it's kind of a Conqueror turret. The 215B is actually the tank destroyer. This actually existed. This was a thing, and Wargaming have kind of done what they do sometimes when they don't really have a sufficient thing to fill in a gap on the tech tree, is they sort of make something up, and that's basically what they've done with the 215B, the non-tank destroyer variant. So it's being taken out of the game, and it's the same gun. It's the 120mm L1A1. It's obviously got improved gun stats. It's also got improved armor. And you can see there, it's significantly improved armor. It's still not great for tier 10, but it's a lot bouncier than it was. And the turret especially, that's a major upgrade. But again, there's a lot of stuff still at tier 10 that is going to have no difficulty penning that. So yeah, also obviously it's a rear-mounted turret. And while rear-mounted turrets are usually very good for side scraping, I mean, you can kind of more get away with it because you can keep a much steeper angle on this thing than you could with, obviously, the Conqueror. You can see there, you know, ricochet angles, but there are just the nature of the hull means that it's not uniform. This bit here where it widens out to encompass the turret ring, that is still pennable, easily pennable, because that's only 102 millimeters of armor. So again, you could try side scraping, but unless you get lucky, if you're actually fighting somebody that knows what they're doing, you're probably going to get penned doing that. So again, I think it's more of a second line heavy. You've got a bit more armor to play with, but it's all about putting that gun to best use, and that means not necessarily being at the front lines. So there we go, the British heavy line. I quite like them so far. I think my least favourite has probably been the Churchill VII. I did okay in it. It's so undergunned for its tier that frankly it's not that much fun to play. But the rest, yeah, they're pretty decent. They're not exactly speed demons, but they have, for their tiers, they've all got, generally speaking, very good gun handling stats, very good accuracy for heavy tanks, and very good rate of fire for heavy tanks. So with the British heavies, it's really more often about the guns than anything else that the tank has. So on the whole, there are easier tank lines to start with, but if you fancy something a bit different, the British heavies might be the way to go. So, I've been nattering on for nearly half an hour. Hopefully most of it's made sense, most of it's been useful. I'm sure if I've made any glaring omissions, Caption Guy will point them out, or if Caption Guy misses anything, which he occasionally does, then people will point them out in the comments section. It's always a comfort to me to know that even Caption Guy can get it wrong, you know? It warms the cockles of my heart, as the saying goes. So, if you did find this useful, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can subscribe to my channel, and as always, stay tuned for more.